Late August 1921. Getaway, Miss Ashby, Jimmy called, when they had got to the cart bridge on the road just outside Thirsk. Though the sun was warm, his idle pursuit of small advantage of the girl had given way to a sense of urgency. He knew vaguely that she was running from him, but that was just a joke. Two men were following her now, and suddenly it seemed serious. Milo, however, did not realize she was being chased until she got to the side of the bridge. For a few moments, she stopped, and looked around her, taking in the tree line and the hedge and the beck. She exhaled, and saw behind her, Jimmy Kent, who had tried to molest her more than once that day. Milo turned, thinking to dip under the bridge and out of his way, for Jimmy still seemed under the influence of his many beers and ciders. And then hands caught her, hands which dragged and pulled, putting her down onto the earth. But Milo didn't fall and somehow looped her way out of the man's grasp, and she saw it was the man who had spoken to her at the tug-of-war. He grinned, and Milo soon found out why. She had headed into the grasp of another man. "Looking for some fun, Missy?" he asked. Milo struggled, but the man held on to her. A scrabbling noise behind them made Milo turn, and to her horror saw Jimmy. She struggled more, even when he called out to them. "Leave her alone," he declared. And to Milo's surprise, they did, and she stumbled onto the soil, watching the men stalk menacingly over to him. He stumbled, his legs still under the influence, and took a hit in the chin from the first man. Milo scrambled back. "Get out of here." Milo knew the voice before she saw Thomas stumble down the bank, and Jimmy scrambled up, as the two men went for him. Milo screamed as Thomas went down, the men attacking him, kicking, punching. She felt her arm being gripped and saw it was Jimmy. She struggled. "Come on," he told her, "you don't want to be here." "I don't want to be with you," she declared, and she kicked his shin and tore away. Jimmy found her by the car, shivering, after he had taken Alfred and Tom with him to find Thomas, and she watched as they shouldered him across the field. Milo felt herself grow cold, at the state of him. "You're here?" he said. Milo backed away. "Look, I am sorry," he told her. "I just wanted to make Ivy jealous." Well, he thought, part of it was that. The other was showing off to Edna Braithwaite. Either way, none of it was really out of attraction to the girl, and while she seemed sweet in a way, she was just too strange to ask out, even if she were available. "Are you married to him?" Jimmy asked. He looked between Milo and Thomas. But Milo was in no mood to be spoken softly to, and rounded on him. "All he wanted was to be your friend." Milo shouted at him. "Your friend, your friend," she repeated. "He is sorry for it, truly." And then, as she saw Thomas taken off to the refreshment tent for a seat, she burst into tears when she saw Alfred holding Thomas's pocket watch. "I got this back off one of them," Alfred told Jimmy. "The other one must have his money." He looked down to Milo, and his tone changed. "What did you do?" he shouted. But Jimmy held up his hands. "I followed her, when I saw her being followed by those two men. Honest," he added. Alfred stooped to Milo's level, as she sobbed into her hands. "Is that true?" "What he says." "He was trying to help you." He waited with patience as Milo stopped crying. Daisy had seen and was coming over to them, with Ivy in pursuit. In the end, yes, Milo managed, and took Thomas's watch from Alfred's hand as she noticed Daisy hurrying over her, a fresh dam of tears breaching its bank, and she turned to the girl's shoulder and cried again. Daisy led her to a bench and sat by her, and would not leave Milo's side until Mrs. Hughes and Mrs. Batemore came to be with her, and even then Mrs. Crawley needed to say some words to Milo before she could be persuaded to get back into the car with the others. 88,888,888 When they returned, Carson was in a bit of a frantic mood, wondering why they were so late, and he was about to launch into a tirade to, well, somebody, when he saw the state that Thomas was in. He heard the story from Jimmy and Daisy, and then the accurate one from Mrs. Hughes before insisting the men take Thomas upstairs and help get him cleaned up. Milo, having been prevented from following them, burst into tears yet again, garnering little sympathy from Mr. Carson. "Just get her into her room," "Mrs. Hughes, we can't have this all night." But Mrs. Hughes had brought an old tin bath in from the outhouse and had the maids fill it with hot water. Milo was under instructions to use the Pears soap Thomas had brought her and have a bath to get off all the dirt from her face and hands, and when she had finished and dried, and found some clothes to wear, she was under more instructions to open the door and they would take the bath away. Milo was, at least, composed enough to move the bath over to the drain where once a plumbed-in sink has stood and tipped the water down it herself before Daisy knocked on the door to ask if she were decent. It was late in the evening when Milo noticed the hall candles go out, Mr. Carson's last jobs of the night before he went upstairs, and Milo counted to 5 minutes in seconds to give him enough time to have got to the first floor at least. Mrs. Patmore could scold her in the morning, Milo reasoned, as she got down large pottery bowls from the dining ware that was for the staff, picking the lock of the pantry, thanks to her dear friend in Ireland, her grandmother's butler Jack Prue, to get at the loaf and the fruit cake and the meat pie that she knew the cook had shelved. It had not needed for their lunch that day because they had been able to go the fair instead. Locking it behind her, Milo filled a metal jug from the tap and found 2 glasses, before crossing the hall and getting up the stairs. Her foot caught on one of the steps, but she managed not to drop anything, and continued up the stairs until she got to the top floor. The men's rooms were first, but she came to a sudden stop when she realized someone was on the landing. It was Tom Branson and, to Milo's amazement, the door between the men's section and the women's section was open and he was whispering to someone who was just on the other side of it. The door closed slowly, and Milo pressed herself into the wall as Tom Branson came her way, head bowed, which was the reason, Milo figured, that he didn't see her. When she was sure she had heard the door on one of the floors below open and then close, she crept to the 3rd door along, hoping she had counted right, for she didn't want to end up in someone else's room. Milo really would be in for a telling off, then. But she was right, and she put down one of the 4 odd bowls to turn the knob on the door. It wasn't locked, and she saw by the dim moonlight on the bed that it was Thomas's room. Milo took the food to the table, and then went back to the jug and glasses, which she put by it, before retrieving the first bowl. Thomas stirred, and turned over. Footsteps outside made Milo freeze in the process of closing the door. She risked it, and then hurried towards Thomas, sliding under his bed. "Mr. Barrow?" A voice, unmistakably Carson's, at the door caused Thomas to wake, and he pulled himself up in bed as the butler flicked on the lights. He shielded his eyes from the glare and narrowed his eyes to see who it was who had woken him. "Mr. Carson," he managed, through split lips. "Oh, well, I see," Mr. Carson called back to Thomas, stepping back from the door threshold after a quick scan of the room for anyone else. "I take it you are alone?" "You just woke me up, Mr. Carson," Thomas pointed out. He looked to the table next to his wardrobe. That was new. He didn't remember anyone bringing him food up earlier. "Yes, well," Mr. Carson said. "I suggest you keep your door locked, Mr. Barrow." And if Charles Carson had taken a moment, he might have been alerted to the key being turned far quicker in the lock than one might have supposed an injured man had managed. "Milo," Thomas managed, shifting about uncomfortably in bed, as he saw her come out from underneath his bed. "Put the light on, will you, and pass that plate, I'm starving." And of course, Milo was most obliging, sitting in the easy chair beside Thomas, eating her own, taking his bowl when he had finished, and handing him a cup of water. But the footsteps had returned. "Mr. Barrow," called Mr. Carson. "Are you sure you haven't got anyone in there with you?" This time, Milo leapt from the chair and opened the wardrobe door, sliding underneath Thomas's tails and trousers, all immaculately laundered and hung, before closing the door. On cue, Thomas heaved himself out of bed and unlocked the door. "Please come in, Mr. Carson, and check for yourself." The butler did indeed come in, and glanced around the room. A few cursory checks, and he was satisfied. Or, at least, Thomas considered, the butler was happy enough to leave him alone. Locking the door behind him, Thomas pulled open the wardrobe door, and hobbled back to bed. As Milo came out of the wardrobe, he frowned at her, which hurt, but it was worth it when she turned and straightened all of his suits which she had disturbed. "You cheeky thing," he told Milo, trying to smile, and then wincing. "If I didn't know better, I would say you have had practice at hiding at short notice." Milo said nothing, just looked at him, instead. "It's not as bad as all that," Thomas tried to assure her. "Thank you for the food. I'm not going to ask how you got hold of that." "From the kitchen," Milo told him, sitting down next to him on the bed. He took her hand. "I know," Thomas replied, in mock admonishment, "but from which side of the pantry door?" And then the tears came again, and Milo sobbed into his shoulder, which made Thomas wince in pain again. He rubbed a hand on her back, and the tears came more intensely for a little longer, before dying away. Thomas knew what she was like, and now she could see he would be all right, and he shuffled over so she could sit next to him on the bed. Something was uncomfortable, and Milo slipped her hand into her trouser pocket and extracted Thomas's watch, and not one but two letters that she had completely forgotten about. "You have it." Thomas couldn't disguise his surprise when she moved her hand over to his and let it go into his palm. "Oh," he added, looking down at the jeweled case, "I never thought I'd see this again." He realized Milo was, however, quite absorbed in a piece of paper in her hand. It looked very much like a letter. He waited, taking a sip from the cup on his bedside table. "It's from Mr. Prue," she said, showing it to Thomas, and he glanced at the foreign letters. He had copied many of those out onto another piece, which was in his drawer. "And who's Mr. Prue?" he asked. "My grandmother's butler," Milo told him, and followed the letters across with her finger. "He asks, when can her ladyship invite my ladyship to see her? He seems like a bit of a cheeky one, this Mr. Prue," Thomas replied, a touch of caution in his voice. "It's just his way. You'd like to talk to him," Milo continued. "You would get on with him if you met him." Thomas replied, doubting very much that he would. She looked at the second, but put that away in her pocket. "From Chadwick," he guessed. But Milo shook her head. "Not today. I haven't anything from him, or the professor." Thomas turned his stiff neck towards her in astonishment. "They send you work, here?" Milo nodded. "Oh yes, of course," she added. "Or how else can we be ready when the professor has set up his experiments?" Milo sighed. But there was no point wishing for something she couldn't have. She knew the Rutherfords were only thinking about her, and how they could take away anything that could be difficult her. If anything told Milo how wanted she was beside the two academics, it was this, and Chadwick's sending her a short note about where his, Cockcroft and Blackett could be found, if necessary. All had rooms above the Cavendish, all three being unmarried. In fact, she had overheard Rutherford telling Chadwick that a man had been selected for a place at Cambridge over him, in New Zealand. But he'd got married, and forfeited his place, which was given to Rutherford. I remembered thinking, Chadwick, that I would never have to dig potatoes again. And Milo was beginning to accept why it was that her being married to Thomas particularly was tolerated. No, not even tolerated, but accepted amongst the professor's team. Nothing would come of it. No household setup requiring Milo's attention. She looked across to her husband and placed her hand in his. He kissed the top of her head. "So, what do you do all day?" Thomas asked her. "What work do you do?" Milo turned to him. It was the first time he had taken an interest in what she did at the laboratory. She wished he had, sooner, and she could have showed him everything in their laboratory at Manchester. "A lot of the times, I look at letters, published papers, journal articles. And it is my job to look for things that connect to the experiments Chadwick is doing, mainly his work, and sometimes the others, if I find any leads I think would be of interest. And, whoever is working, I assist them in their experiments. It's a valuable position for a postgraduate," she added. "I know they had many applicants, until the professor closed it and gave it to me." And Milo dipped her head again, and read the Irish words in the letter from Mr. Prue. And for the first time, Thomas felt proud of Milo, the little girl he had rescued so many times from various situations, from bodies of water, trees, cupboards, stairs, people, especially people. He thought again about how it was that she could barely think of words to put together to communicate with other people, but when it came to atomic physics she could communicate with a high degree of discrimination, explaining to anyone who asked, no matter who they were, what it was they wanted to know. If it had to do with subatomic particles, Milo would charm your soul. I could not do it without Ashby. Rutherford's words echoed in Thomas's head. She sees things no one else does. She has accelerated our work beyond all hope. They had been at the evening of her presentation, and Professor Rutherford had looked across to her, as she had been speaking to Cora Crawley. But how, sir? Thomas had asked. He had not replied. Perhaps he couldn't. Perhaps sometimes people learn to do things and sometimes they knew them by instinct. He had an instinct for clocks. He shook the idea from his mind. Too many painful memories attached to his happiest. Worse than the physical cruelty was the mental damage his father had inflicted. Apart from the one in his hand, memory forged new because of Milo. No good memory existed untarnished. The dish in Milo's lap almost slipped to the floor, but Thomas caught its rim and dragged it back to her lap. She pocketed the letter and took it, and took too, the other plate and cups, and stacked them neatly on his table. Nothing left. They had both been hungry. Then she turned off the lights, her lights, and settled down next to Thomas. He curled his arm around her and she put her head to his shoulder and her hand softly on his chest. Thomas moved her around to get comfortable and she could feel his heart beating through his vest as he settled back down again. Was this what being married was like? If it was, why did everyone make such a fuss about it? It was a marvelous arrangement for her and Thomas, anyway. If this hadn't been Thomas, it could have been Ernest. When they had been next to one another when she was small, to help her get to sleep. Her darling brother. But Milo could not imagine what it would be like properly married. She had found a book in Mrs. Hughes's sitting room once, about love when a person was married. At first it surprised her, though it all made sense. It was a little like plumbing, but when Milo had imagined two people actually carrying out these things, which they must do, for babies were born with alarming regularity, Milo knew she did not want that with Thomas, not anyone, and would feel horrified if anyone wanted that with her. What is it all about? Thomas asked her, taking Milo's hand. The work you do. What? Milo put down the letter again. Your work. Professor Rutherford's. Everything. Everything? Milo thought about it all. It would take some time to tell him everything. She thought, and thought of his timepieces, those he seemed to know as old friends when he, Ernest and Milo had been at Henry Barrow's shop together. You remember about clocks? She asked him. You spoke about time, and how this was important to the professor. Didn't he speak about a man in Switzerland? And Milo thought of the letter from Dr. Einstein, who had sent a short letter explaining to the professor that, because of the Solway Conference's decision to exclude any German chemists and physicists, he would not be in attendance, as a show of solidarity. Dr. Einstein tells of time's relativity. The train journey, Thomas remembered. He also said matter and energy are equivalent. So, what things are made of has equal energy. Like arithmetic. Thomas had been good at arithmetic at school, about the only thing he had been good at. That was when he could go, when he was not recovering from a black eye or bruises that would show. Yes, Milo agreed. In an atomic transformation, we find a reaction is missing some of matter, then the difference must be energy. Atomic transformation? Thomas asked. That sounds like witchcraft to me. Milo looked startled. No, she said. Although the professor has managed to break apart atoms of nitrogen, they became oxygen. Thomas stared at her. Milo wasn't joking. I wish I understood that, Thomas told her. Did Ernest know it? It was the first time Thomas had mentioned her brother's name since they had got married, and she felt a tug in her chest. Better than me, Milo told him. He would have been at the conference this year, without a doubt. He might even have had a doctorate by now and be able to propose his own research field. Her hand drifted to her pocket. The second letter. But ... you do know, she told him. You know why clocks get slower. Yes, he agreed. From an horologist point of view, change in temperature, stress on internal parts, humidity. So you admit, they do get slower. Of course. And one of the factors you have named has caused the difference? Thomas looked at her. He was unused to conferential argument designed to challenge, and therefore refute or solidify hypotheses. Well, I never, he broke off. It felt like he was on the very verge of some sort of understanding. It could not be disputed that clocks could be slowed down. But he also had a suspicion that Milo had cleverly made him feel like this, over a complicated subject. She had a cleverness so subtle that he could only admire her for it. But then, she sighed, the professor told me that the German scientists were stopped from attending the conference he attended, in Belgium this year. Milo went on, feeling the same sorrowfulness that she had felt when he had first told them. Well, good, said Thomas, firmly. But, no, Milo replied. If they have things to share, it is not. I can understand about Abbey, she added, and when he asked, told her about ammonia, and its abhorrent use in the trenches. Worse than mustard gas, he told her. And Milo thought how sorry she had been when she had heard how Fritz Haber's wife had begged and begged him not to agree to its use, and had killed herself when he ignored her. But they could have shared what they knew, Milo persisted. Anything they hadn't already surrendered to the invading British troops and government scientists. Anyway, she realized Thomas was looking at her. Oh, said Thomas, and take from the other scientists for their own needs. Germany has been whipped, its land taken, its money worthless. People in that country will not put up with that. I would like to go to Germany, Milo told him. Would you? Thomas frowned at her. He wouldn't go to Germany if someone paid him, nor France, either, at least, not where the trenches were. Elise Meitner writes to me, she told him. I think the professor asked her to. She used to work for him, but now we write to one another. She is in charge of her own research projects. Think of that. But she's in Germany, Thomas told her. Yes, Milo agreed. What she discusses is beyond countries, beyond allies and the Hun. All our work feeds into other work. We don't own it, we just study it, like time. We can't own time. No, Thomas told her, suddenly feeling tired again. We can't own time. He made to lie down and Milo moved away, about to get up. But instead, he drew her to him and they were like how they had been, a year before on their wedding night. Did he remember it was a year ago? It didn't matter if he didn't. And Milo was asleep before Thomas, whose aches and pains were keeping him from sleeping himself. Happy anniversary, Thomas Barrow whispered, kissing Milo's cheek, and settled down next to her, closing his eyes.